Welcome to Lesson 22 in Through the New Testament in Ancient Greek for absolute beginners. My name is Helene Istay, and I'm your guide as we read through the New Testament in its original, beautiful language, the language of ancient Greece, which, coincidentally, was called Helleniste. Because each lesson will build on previous lessons, be sure to start with Lesson 1. And please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel if you feel so led. Let's get started. So in this lesson, we are going to read through Matthew chapter 9, verses 27 through 38, which will bring us all the way up to chapter 10. And in this lesson, we're covering Jesus healing two blind men, Jesus healing a mute man, and Jesus' discussion of the sheep and the harvest. Today, we're going to focus primarily on verbs. We're going to cover four main moods: the imperative mood, the infinitive mood, participles, which are actually more accurately described as a non-finite verb form, and the indicative mood. And within those moods, we're going to talk about the present tense and the aorist tense in the imperative mood, the present tense and the aorist tense in the infinitive mood, the present tense and the aorist tense and the perfect tense in the participles, and the present, aorist, and imperfect tenses in the indicative. And of course, we're going to also talk about their voices, whether it's active, middle, or passive, or whether the middle and the passive share the same form. All right, we're going to get started with reading Matthew chapter 9, verses 27 through 31. Kai paraganti ekathen to Jesu e kaluthesan auto dua tu floi, crasantes kai legantes, eleesan gemas huias David, elthantide eistain oikian, pros elthan auto hoi tu floi, kai lege autois ha Jesus. Pistuete hati dunamai tuta poiesai? Legusin auto, nai curie, tate hapsato ton ophthalmon auton, legon, kata ten pistin humon genetheto humin. Kai ene okthesan auton hoi ophthalmoi, kai ene brimethe autois ha Jesus, legon. Horate medes ginosketo, hoide ex elthantes diaphemisan auton, en hale te ge ekene. All right, before we start talking about these verses, I wanted to do a quick overview of the various tenses, moods, and non-finite verb forms and voices in Koine Greek. So when you're in Bible Hub, you'll see under the verb a V, and then after that you'll have the tense, and then the mood, and then the voice. And then you'll have another dash, and then you'll have a number, and whether it's singular or plural. So this would be a verb that's present, indicative, active voice, first person singular. All right, and for example, the verb lego means I say. So that's an example of a verb that's present, indicative, active, first person singular, I say. Now, I put this in order: tense, mood / non-finite verb forms, and voice, because that's the way it's organized here. You have your tense, you have your mood or non-finite verb form. It's not quite as easy to say in the middle. And then you have this active, meaning your voice. So you have active, middle, and passive. So that's what you see here. So that's why I put this in this order. It's the same order that it's listed. But it's actually more appropriate to think about your moods and non-finite verb forms as being the big circle. And then that's divided into different slices for your tenses. These are each of different tenses within your mood. And then within these tenses, you'll then have three different divisions for active voice, middle voice, and passive voice. So that's kind of how they're set up. So you have your moods and non-finite verb forms, and within each of these moods, let's say the indicative, you'll have different tenses. And within those tenses, you'll have different voices. So this is the biggest group, your mood, and then within that is the tense, and within the tense is the voice. So hopefully that helps you. So PFURL is a shortcut for the different tenses, and not every mood has all of these tenses. Indicative mood does have all these tenses, but not the others. So indicative has a present tense, an imperfect tense, an aorist tense, a future tense, a perfect tense, and a pluperfect tense. So I'm not going to explain all of those again in this video because we don't have a whole lot of time, but I put the colors up here just because I'll be using those a little bit, and the colors kind of match what their tense is. And then we have these moods here. We have 4 moods: indicative mood, subjunctive mood, optative mood, and imperative mood. And then we have these non-finite verb forms, which don't really exist on a timeline, which is why they're called non-finite verb forms. So the infinitive, like to be or to go, and the participle, being, going, those don't really indicate whether it's future, past, or present. So that's why they're called non-finite verb forms instead of moods, because within these moods you do have a little bit of an understanding of time. And then the voices, so active is when the subject is performing the action. Middle is when the subject is performing the action on him, her, or itself. So let me just write that down. Subject is performing the action, just like in the active tense, but it's on himself or on herself. If the subject isn't a human, then you would have it on itself. So subject performs the verb action on himself. And now the subject in passive is not doing the action at all. It's actually receiving the action. So you could say, an example is, I see would be active. I see myself would be a middle. And I am seen would be passive. Okay? And then there are some forms that share the same endings, even if they're middle or passive. They kind of can be both. All right, so that's why I put this little kind of L shape here. So that's what I want to say about voices. We'll talk a lot more about the tenses and the moods and non-finite verb forms in future slides, and we won't cover everything today, but I do want to get you more familiar with how the endings and the beginnings and the middles of verbs change depending on their use in terms of their mood, their tense, and their voice. All right, so I've put a little rounded square around each of these verbs that we see in these verses that we just read. Let's start with this indigo color, which is indicative. So we have ekalutheson for they followed. All right, the 2 blind men followed Jesus. Just a note here that this verb, akalutheo, which we'll talk about soon, it takes the dative. So 2 blind men followed Jesus from there. So, and remember, to Jesu, that's common in Greek to use the article with even a proper noun. All right, so that's why this is in the dative here. And then this participle is also in the dative because it's describing Jesus. All right, so that was a little confusing, and if you don't understand that, don't worry. So this is our first indicative. So indicative is talking about something that actually happens. It's kind of the world of reality. So they followed. And then we come down to this one. In this case, it's third person plural. We know it's the blind men came. So they came. So it's just describing what happens in reality. Pros eilthon. And then here we have an indicative that's present. He says to them. So says is third person singular. So we know that it's Jesus. Jesus, ha Jesus, says to them. And then this one is also indicative, but in this case we're talking about a question. Do you believe? Pistuete, pistuete. That, and then another indigo is indicative. Dunamai, I am able. So do you believe that I am able? And then down here, they say, legusin. This is a capital lambda, by the way, that upside down V. So legusin, they say to him, yes. I should probably point out that this nay or nai is yes in Greek. You would think it might be no, because nai sounds very much like nay or no in English. Yes, Lord. Then he touched. So hapsato is indicative, just describing something in reality. And then their eyes were opened. Here we have indicative. It's a passive because the eyes are being opened. They're receiving the opening. So this is also indigo. And then strictly instructed them. Again, this one is indicative because it's describing what's happening. And they make him known. So this is another indicative. We covered the indicative verbs. Let's look at this peach color. This is for participles. And in participles, we have two examples of participle tenses in this verse. In these verses, we have present here, the P is for present. And we have aorist, which is a past participle. And that A is for aorist. So let's look at what these are. So passing on from there, this is modifying Yesu, because the blind men followed Jesus, and we know after akalutheo, after the verb to follow, you're going to have the dative. And you can tell Yesu is dative because of the article, to. If it was genitive, it has the same form Yesu, but then it would be to Yesu. So here we know that they're following Jesus, who is passing on from there. This DMS from the participle, present participle, matches the dative masculine singular of to Yesu. So we know that this passing on from there is describing Jesus. So in English, we might want to say, two blind men started to follow him, Jesus, as he was passing on from there, or who was passing on from there. That might be a good way to translate it in English. So paraganti is just a present participle describing Jesus. Now we have a nominative masculine plural and nominative masculine plural, two different participles that are present, and this time they're describing the blind men, right? These tufloi. And by the way, this is a substantive adjective. And the adjective is blind, but in this case it means blind men, two blind people. All right, so crying out and saying are participles, present participles, describing the blind men. All right, and then down here we have DMS. So DMS, what other DMS do we see? Well, we see a DMS here coming to him. So the blind men came to him, and it's modifying this to him, so Jesus. So he says to them, and then he talks about, do you believe? All right, let's look at this. Here we have another present participle active, and this one is from the verb lego, meaning to say. So lego, saying. And now this own here is a really important, you're going to see a lot of that at the end of present participles if they're nominative masculine singular, so just keep track of that. Saying, according to your faith, let it be to you. And then down here we have legon again, saying. So often you'll find legon as kind of an introduction, almost like functioning as quotation marks, be over the around what he's saying. So here he says something, and here. So legon acts as almost like a quotation mark would in English. And then one final participle down here, having gone out, nominative masculine plural, to modify them. They, having gone out, they made known. So that's an aorist indicative active, so that this should be made known, but it's basically being translated into present in English as kind of a historical present. All right, so we talked about the indicative, we've talked about the participles. Let's go to this red one here. This is imperative, like imperial red. And imperative is just like a command in English. So have mercy on us. Talking to Jesus, second person singular, they're asking for Jesus to have mercy on them. And they call him the son of David, which is interesting, kind of a reference to the Messiah. And then the next imperative is here. This is actually a third person singular imperative, which we don't actually have in English. In English, we may say, let it be, or let it go, let it be, let them go, etc. But in Greek, they have a third person singular command form. And in this case, you'll recognize it by ato, usually. And this is passive, would be theto. Let it be to you according to your faith. So basically, you believe, therefore it's going to happen. All right, and then here we have two more imperatives. Horate, in this case, second person plural, because Jesus is talking to the two blind men, comes from horao. Horate, see to it that. Interesting that we use the same thing in English. We have see that. When this means to see, they had the same use of to see in ancient Greek. And then no one knows. In this case, we have third person singular because we want no one to know. This no one is what ginesketo is talking to. No one will know. Let no one know, in English we would say. Let no one know. And then this horate is basically see to it that you let no one know. It's kind of like emphasis, like don't let anyone know. Make sure. And another emphasis is a strictly instructed verb. Like this, Jesus really doesn't want them to tell anybody. But of course, what do? They tell everybody. All right, and then the last thing I want to point out is this inchworm, green, which is your infinitive form in Greek. And a lot of time, the infinitive ends with either ein or I. Here we have the I, which is a sign of our aorist infinitive. So, whoops, let me back up here. All right, infinitive is what I wanted to write. So, your infinitive either ends with ein or I, and I is the ending you'd expect for aorist. And we'll talk about in the future why you would use an aorist infinitive versus a present infinitive. But here, I am able to do this, exactly the way we'd use the infinitive in English. Do you believe that I am able to do this? All right, moving on. So before we move on in explaining these verses, I want to cover the present participles of luo. And luo here is our favorite Greek verb because it's very simple. It just has the lambda upsilon, and then this omega is for your indicative present active first person singular form. And we're going to review our present indicative active form soon in this lesson. But luo is one of our favorite verbs. It's not used a lot in the New Testament, but it's very simple, has just the lambda upsilon. And the other good thing, which is in black everywhere, is that it's not very irregular. So it follows kind of the right patterns. You don't have all sorts of exceptions, which you do with a lot of other Greek verbs. It means to loose. So I like to think of it as like a jailer would loose a prisoner, or a cowboy would loose a cow. And then here, loosing oneself. Let's say you're all bound up in a rope. You loose yourself from it, right? And let's say you're a cow and you're being loosed by the cowboy, being loosed. So that kind of helps you see how we use these participles in English. We have this ing. So ing, ing, ing. All right, so present participle active form of luo. I'm just going to read them first and then I'll make some comments. Luon, luusa, luon, luontos, luuses, luontos, luonti, luuse, luonti, luonta, luusan, luon, luontes, luusai, luonta, luontone, luuson, luontone, luusin, luusais, luusin, luontas, luusas, luonta. Okay, so luon is very similar. You're going to see a lot of this form in the New Testament, the nominative, masculine, singular form of the present participle active. So the accent stays on le. Even though this becomes long, we still have 2 counts on the long vowel. This is the third to last count. So we can keep the accent here. You don't have to move it over. If we had one more syllable at the end, this would have to move over. But legon is saying, luon is loosing. All right, and then notice how everything else starts with aunt. Aunt, 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 aunt. The only exception is this luus is going to be similar to what the feminine is. So you have this us change. And I think it's probably because luantine may not sound right to the ancient Greeks, but luusin. Luusin instead of luantine. So luusin. Say that over and over to yourself, and then luantine will sound weird. But anyway, you have the same with a neuter. And notice with the neuter, you have the same patterns as you find with other adjectives. This guy is the same as this one. So with other adjectives, the genitive masculine and the genitive neuter match, luantas, luantas. The dative masculine singular and the dative neuter singular match, anti. The accusative does not match the neuter because the neuter, nominative, and accusative match each other. Now we will see that sometimes these three are all the same, but not often. And then we also have the same situation. Genitive plural is the same with masculine and neuter, and dative plural is the same in masculine and neuter, and the same with the plural of the nominative and neuter accusative. We have luanta, luanta. All right, now let's take a look at the middle and passive forms. Now we use the M/P here because both middle and passive verbs share these endings. So you don't really have to care whether it's a middle or passive use, except for in translation to translate them. All right, the key part here is this omen or amen with the omicron, mu, epsilon nu is everywhere. Notice all of them have amen. And that should be an indication immediately to you that you're in present participle middle passive, right? So the amen, maybe the middle, the mu in amen can help you recognize this, but middle has amen. And I've heard some professors say the men sit in the middle of the pew. The men are in the middle. So just that kind of should help you remember middle passive. So I'm going to go ahead and read these now. Luamenos, luamene, luamenon, luamenu, luamenes, luamenu, luameno, luamene, luameno, luamenon, luamenane, luamenon, luamenoi, luamenai, luamena, luamenon, 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 luamenois, luamenais, luamenois, luamenus, luamenas, luamena. All right, so notice the accent moves around a little bit here. So that's kind of how they would have pronounced it. Remember, Greek was a very musical language. So often the accent made a difference. So here you know what the accent is here because this is a long vowel, as is this one, as is this one, as is this one. So the eta and the omega are long vowels, which is why the accent moves over. All right. U is also long. That would be, omicron by itself would be short, but omicron upsilon is long. So that's kind of the reason that you have these vowel movements. If you have long vowels like ois and us are also long, and own is long. So that was when there's long vowels at the end, you're going to have the accent on men. Otherwise, it'll be on the ah. Notice how oi is short. Luamenoi, luamenai. So I is short and ah is short. All right, so another thing, just I want to point out the similarities. Again, you know about the genitive and dative in both the singular and the plural. In this case, you also have the feminine following. All right, so not so with the present active, but with the present middle and passive. All three of these genitive plural genders are the same. We also have the same thing with a neuter nominative and accusative, both with the singular and the plural matching each other. All right, so that should be fairly understandable. And again, we have this iota subscript with the dative singular. So that should help you recognize that as dative singular. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the verses again, and we'll look at some verbs in particular. All right, so here we have and passing on. Now remember, this is a present participle that is modifying Jesus, who is being followed by the blind men. So it's a little complicated, but two blind men followed him, which is not necessary, but sometimes they repeat him, the Jesus, who was passing on from there. All right, so in English we would say Jesus was passing on from there and he was followed by the blind men, or the blind men followed him. All right, so this is parago. And now parago is actually a form of the verb ago. So ago, not a form, but a similar verb. It has this para or par prefix, which means by or away. So ago means I lead or I pass, and parago means I lead by or I pass away from something. So this is helpful. This is what's called the lexical form or the original word. So I'm going to write that down here, just in case you hear me call something the lexical form, you know that's what Bible Hub is talking about, is the original word. And in Greek, this is what you would find when you look a word up in the lexicon. Lexicon is like a Greek dictionary. So a lexicon will have alphabetized words in their lexical form. And for verbs, the lexical form is their present tense, indicative mood, active form, first person singular with that omega. All right, so knowing that, we have parag, this is our root here, and our ending anti. We know that is dative masculine singular, present participle active of parago. All right, next we have the verb akalutheo, which is to follow, or I follow, literally. And then we can see here, we're not going to talk about this too much, but the a becomes a. And that's an indication in the indicative mood. The a becoming a means that something is going to be in the past. It's kind of they call it an augment. And that augment clues us in that so this is something in the past. All right, so a becoming a is an augment. You also have some other augments, but that's just the one we're seeing here. So ka, lu stays the same, but now instead of the omega, we now have this epsilon becomes the eta. It's another thing that will happen. We'll talk about that later when we talk about these verbs here, which are contract verbs that have a vowel before the omega. So the eta is from the contract verb, but then ason is going to be our ending for third person plural aorist. We'll talk about that in the future, but this is probably even too much detail right now. I just want to give you a little overview of some of these signs that you can look for. And then to scream and to cry out, krazo, or I scream, I cry out. Here we have krazo, or kraz, is our root. I'm not very good at this drawing. And then antes should look familiar. We have the ant s, so we can tell that's nominative masculine plural, antes. Crying out, and also legantes. Again, we have lego, our root is leg, and then antes is our ending that shows nominative masculine plural, present participle active. And then we have an imperative. Eleo is our verb. Here's another contract verb because it has the epsilon accented before the omega. So that means to have pity on, or to show mercy to, have mercy to, or literally, I have pity, I have mercy, I show mercy. And this is our aorist imperative active second person singular verb, meaning have mercy on. Second person singular because we're talking to Jesus. I want to next talk about our aorist participles. So a few slides ago, we talked about present participles. So something that's loosing or being loosed or loosing myself. Now let's talk about aorist participles. And in English, our past participles, which is what this is basically, we use have. So having loosed myself, oneself, ourselves, etc. Having been loosed. All right, so just to kind of put it into context, so you see what I'm talking about with these participles in English. Let's say having loosed the cattle, the cowboy went home, right? So, or the cowgirl went home. In Greek, though, this is going to change depending on whether whatever it's modifying is masculine, feminine, or neuter. So in this case, this would be describing the cowboy, and these would be describing the cowgirl. All right, and then having loosed ourselves from jail. So you might be telling a story about how you escaped from jail. Having loosed ourselves from jail, we crossed the river, something like that. So here, this would be talking about something you're doing to yourself. So these forms are all going to be describing another person or thing that just loosed itself. And then here, having been loosed. So the cattle, having been loosed by the cowboy, went to a different part of the pasture, something like that. All right, so my little hints here are for the aorist participle active, it's sont and sauce. Sant and sauce. For the aorist participle in the middle, you're going to look for samen. Again, men, for the men are in the middle. And then having been loosed is going to be thent and thace. Thent and thace. So sant, sauce, samen, and thent, thace. All right, so lusas, lusasa, lusan, lusantas, lusases, lusantas, lusanti, lusase, lusanti, lusanta, lusasan, lusan, lusantes, lusasai, lusanta, lusantone, lusason, lusantone, lusasin, lusasais, lusasin, lusantas, lusasas, lusanta. All right, now that is all for having loosed. Okay, so there's 24 different ways, although some of them are the same, to say having loosed in ancient Greek. Don't you love it? Here, having loosed oneself, there are 24 ways to say that as well. And again, the common patterns I've put in the same colors. And then lusamenos, lusamene, lusamenon, lusamenu, lusamenes, lusamenu, lusameno, lusamene, lusameno, lusamenon, lusamenane, lusamenon, lusamenoi, lusamenai, lusamena, lusamenon, 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 lusamenois, lusamenice, lusamenois, lusamenus, lusamenas, lusamena. So again, I've colored all of the common forms so you can see the patterns. This is 24 different ways of saying having loosed oneself. And then moving on to having been loosed, thent and thace. Here we have luthace, luthesa, luthen, luthentos, lutheses, luthentos, luthenti, lutheses, luthenti, luthenta, lutheson, luthen, luthentes, luthesi, luthenta, luthentone, lutheson, luthentone, luthesine, luthesis, luthesine, luthentos, luthesas, luthenta. All right, again, so just notice this common thing that you see repeated over and over with thent. So I'm going to try, and again with the same thing, with the feminine forms encroaching on the masculine neuter in the dative plural, this thace, kind of the exception to the thent, but then you have thent again. And then with the feminine, it's all thace. And then with the neuter, it's identical to the masculine except for here, and here, and here, and here. Pretty much where we expect it, right? All right, I don't expect you to learn this or memorize this right away, but I think it is helpful to hear it. And if you want to just go through and repeat these to yourself, it will be very helpful, I believe, to you recognizing them when we're seeing them in the New Testament. All right, so let's look at the verbs on this second line here. We're spending a lot of time on Matthew 9, 27 through 31, but we will learn a lot about verbs as we do this. So we have first one is elthonti. Now this is an irregular verb. Instead of the beginning starting with erk, as you would expect, it starts with elth. You'll start seeing that a lot. In fact, you probably recognize that. Elth is going to be for a lot of tenses when you're using the verb erkamai, elthonti. So we do recognize this onti. The weird thing is, this is not what you would expect for aorist active participles. Don't worry about this too much now, but when you have these weird irregulars, they sometimes take the present endings. So don't worry too much about this right now. And then we have another one with elth. In this case, it's eilth, because we have an aorist, because this elth has become augmented. So this comes from pros erkamai, which means to approach or draw near. And notice these are both middle-only verbs with the omai. Omai will tell you. If it was omega, you'd know it could have an active tense. When it's omai, these middle-only verbs act as active, but they really have this middle form. So usually verbs of motion and verbs of emotion, anytime you have generally intransitive verbs will have this middle only. And I'm just going to write this up here so you know. Intransitive. My dots are showing up. All right, so intransitive verbs like I approach, I draw near. Generally, you could say I approach the temple, but it's really talking about what you're doing. You're moving yourself towards something. So that's kind of an intransitive idea, the idea that you're just doing something of your own ability, of your own power. So, and then Lego here, let me just explain this here. Pros eilthon, this is an aorist indicative active third person plural, talking about the blind men, came to him. All right, and then Lego we have here, he says. So this is present indicative active third person singular, and it's telling us that Jesus is the one saying, third person singular, modifying Jesus, or he's the subject. And now we have pistuete. This is from the verb pistuo, and notice we have pistu is our root, and then the omega changes to ete for present. So present indicative active second person plural. And then dunamai actually is the lexical form. It's the first person singular of the present indicative active. So dunamai, do you believe that I am able to do this? All right, so since we saw a couple of present indicative, the pistuete and lege, let's look at those forms again. I'm just going to say them real quick. Luo, lues, lue. Luomen, luete, luusin. Those endings are going to be very common throughout the New Testament. So I encourage you to start memorizing that. O, eis, e, amen, ete, usin. All right, now for middle verbs like erkamai, the endings are omai, e, etai, ametha, este, antai. So I'll pronounce it all together. Erkamai, erke, erkatai, erkametha, erkeste, erkantai. And again, you're not going to remember these right away, but over time you will start recognizing them. And wonderfully, we have the same endings for the passive voice. So in this case, if you wanted to say I was loosed from jail, you would say luamai. You were loose from jail, lue. Luo I loose, luamai I was loose. Lues you loose, lue you were loosed. And notice how similar that sounds to he, she, it loses, but you can tell from the written form, a sound. These two will sound alike, lue and lue. But lue, he, she, it looses, luatai, he, she, or it was loosed. And then we have luamen, which is we loose, and then luametha, we were loosed. Luate, you all loose. Lueste, you all were loosed. And luusin, they loose, versus luantai, they were loosed. All right, so even though these guys have the middle or the middle passive endings, they actually in English sound like they're active, I come. But you can't really turn that around and say I was come, or it's usually nonsensical to try and make a passive out of the middle only verbs. All right, let's go ahead and move on. All right, so let's take a look at these last two rows. We first see kai eneok thesan, which means were opened. Auton hoi ophthalmoi. So we're talking about the eyes being opened. So they didn't open themselves. They were opened by someone else, in this case, Jesus. So that's third person plural for matching the eyes. And it's aorist indicative passive, were opened. And now this is an interesting verb. It comes from anoigo, which means I open. And because it's aorist and we want to augment it to show it's in the past, we have this alpha becoming eta. We also have an additional eta here after this on, and we have the oi, omicron iota, becoming the omega with an iota subscript. So we have three different ways of showing this is in the past. This is kind of not usual in Greek, but it's kind of interesting to point that out. And then thesan is our third person plural ending for passive, aorist passive. And passive is generally, there generally will be a theta of some sort. Not always, but theta is a good indicator of this passive. All right, so our next verb here is from the verb embrimaomai. So this is a middle-only verb, which is appropriate because it's an emotional verb. He's being moved with anger or admonishing sternly. This second meaning is more appropriate because Jesus isn't angry at the blind men. He's just sternly instructing them not to do something. So we have aorist, and notice we have, interesting, the mu here changes to a nu, and then this is where the augment goes to show us in the aorist tense, the past tense. So instead of eme, it becomes ene. And then brimaomai, we have brimethe. So methe is an indication that it's passive, or middle in this case, because it's a middle-only verb. He strictly instructed them. So aorist, indicative, passive, third person singular. And then legon is what we would expect for our nominative masculine singular present participle. So lego, you just add the nu to make it the present participle. Legon, saying. Horate comes from the verb horao, which means I see, I perceive, I attend to. So horao becomes horate in the present imperative. So this is a present imperative, active, second person plural, because Jesus is telling it to the two blind men. And then nobody knows, we already talked about this. This is our third person singular imperative. That is ginosketo, and it comes from ginosco, which means I come to know, I recognize, I perceive, ginosco. And then finally, over here we have exerkomai, which is to come out of or to go out of. Remember, it's the combination of ek with erkomai, so it becomes exerkomai. And then the omai indicates obviously middle only, just like erkomai. And then we have this weird elf again, exelfantes. And the ontes should remind you of the present participle. Now in this case, it's aorist because this is what's called a second aorist verb, and it takes the present ending. So again, this is a little confusing. Don't worry about it, but ontes is our present participle endings. But because this is a second aorist, and we can tell because it's also got the augment, we know that this ending is going to be used even if it's aorist. So the present participle endings are used for second aorist verbs, even though they're in the aorist. All right, so don't worry about this. This is a having gone out. This is an aorist participle, past participle. And then they make known. So in this case, it's in English they translate it here as present, but it's actually they made known. They made known. It's probably translated present here because it helps understand the order. So they went out first and then they made known. So, but it's kind of like a historical present. But the Greek is actually aorist. They made known. So aorist, indicative, active, third person plural. They made him known in that whole area. Exactly what he asked them not to do. All right, let's go ahead and read Matthew chapter 9, verses 32 through 34. Autonde exerkomenon idu, prosenikan auto anthropon kofan, daimonizomenon, kai ekblethentas tu daimoniu, elalesen ha kofas, kai ethaumasen hoi akloi, legantes, udepate ephane hutos ento Israel, hoide pharisaioi elegan, ento arkanti ton daimonion ekbale ta daimonia. All right, let's first take a look at our indicative verbs with this indigo color. They brought, pros e nekan. And then we have the crowds marveled, ethaumasan. And then never was it seen, ephane. So here we have elegan is imperfect indicative active. We haven't seen many imperfects, but this is distinguished from the aorist in that it's talking about something that is ongoing in the past. They were saying is a good translation. Instead of said, they were saying. It was kind of ongoingly they were saying. And then he casts out is our present tense indicative active from ekbalo. All right, so with prepositions, we have exerchomai with a present participle that is middle, because it comes from erchomai, a middle only verb. Exerchamenon. Notice this men is a sign of the middle. And then we have possessed by a demon. So in this case, we have present participle that is middle and passive as well, because he was possessed by a demon. It was happening to him. And then having been cast out, the demon. So modifying the demon, we have genitive, having been cast out. So you're expecting it to be passive, which it is. And then aorist, which it is, because it's already been, it happened already, and when the next thing happens. So aorist, participle, passive, genitive, neuter, singular, to match the genitive neuter singular of demon. And then we have legontes, which is our present participle for lego, but it's nominative masculine plural. So legon would be nominative masculine singular. Legontes would be our nominative masculine plural. And then last, here we have an imperative. This imperative, which means look, basically, behold, look, it's become kind of more of an expression. Let's take a look at these verbs in more detail here. We have exerchamenon, which is our participle, middle, because we can tell from the men, from exerchomai. And now the changes we see here, exerchomai, you can look, the stem is going to be everything before the omai, and we still have that, exerch. And then we have amenon. So this is a middle passive ending for genitive masculine plural. Now, why is it genitive masculine plural? Why is this genitive masculine plural? Well, if you remember, we have that genitive absolute construction. So it's usually to indicate while or as this was happening. So as they were going out, so you can just think of them as like in the process of going out, then they brought a mute man to him. All right, so that's why it's genitive masculine plural, to match they. All right, and then we have edu, which is basically here, it's just a see, lo, behold, it becomes just a form, but it actually originally wasn't the imperative form of horao. Okay, next we have prosfero. Prosfero means I bring to or I offer. So fero by itself, which actually I don't have to write because it's right over here, means I bear, I carry, I bring forth. But prosfero means I bring to or I offer, like a sacrifice would be prosfero. They brought to him, so they brought to him, emphasizing somebody is actually carrying this mute man to them, to Jesus. All right, and then we have this interesting long word, to be possessed by a demon in English. I am possessed by a demon. You would say daimonizomai. So you take off this daimonizomai is the root, and then you have daimoniz, and then amenon. Just very similar here. Instead of amenon, it's amenon, which indicates it's accusative masculine singular to describe this mute man. Now remember, we could just say kophon. Kophon means a mute person, but here some manuscripts had anthropon, a mute man, to describe it as a man. But you don't really need man because this can be a substantive adjective. And then having been cast out. So we have ekbalo, which means I throw, I cast, I put out, I banish. Remember, we have balo, which means I throw, but this is more of a I throw out when you add the ek to it. So this one is aorist participle, passive. Ekblethentos. So remember thent. So ekble, this is a second aorist verb, so when it's in the aorist form, ekbal changes to ekble. Don't worry about that. We'll talk more about second aorist verbs. I'm going to write it down here so you know what I'm referring to in the future. But second aorist, like balo and others, have these weird forms at the beginning. So thentos we recognize, right? And that's the genitive neuter singular to describe this genitive neuter singular demon. Daimoniu is the genitive form. I think that pretty much covers it for these verses. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's continue these verses looking at these second and third lines. We first have this verb laleo, which means to talk or I talk. Notice it's what we call a contract verb, and that's because it has this vowel, in this case an epsilon, before that final omega. So this is actually not exactly how you would say I talk. It would be more this. The epsilon goes away and it becomes lalo. But don't worry about that. I just wanted to point out that this is what we call a contract verb, and sometimes you'll have an alpha here, and you'll also sometimes have an omega, but that's not as common as the epsilon and alpha contract verbs. But anyway, so with this contract verb in the aorist indicative active, third person singular, is elalesen. Elalesen. And notice here we have our augment to put it in the past with aorist, and then la lesen is our third person ending, asen, for a contract verb. First of all, normally it would be an epsilon, but this eta comes from the contract, so it becomes a long. And then that's the ending for the third person singular aorist indicative active. We are not covering those forms in this video, so don't worry too much about that. And then we have ethaumasan. Ethaumasan comes from thaumazo, which means I marvel, I wonder. So you can see here we have the augment, which shows that it's in the past, aorist, indicative, and it's also active. The crowds marveled. And again, we have third person. Here you have asan for third person plural, and here you would have esen, comes asen with the contract vowel. All right, and now we have legantes. We've seen that already, so we won't spend too much time, but this is just a present participle active, nominative masculine plural. So ontes, remember our aunt with the present participle. That comes from Lego, and we also have one down here, which is the imperfect of Lego. All right, so moving on, we now come to ephane, which means was it seen, or it was seen. If you want to phrase it as a normal sentence, this is kind of an expression. But ephane comes from the verb phino, which means I bring light to, I cause to appear. So never has it appeared, I guess is another way of saying this. Never has it been brought to light. So again, we have phino, we have the epsilon here is your augment, just like we saw here with elalesen and ethaumasan. This augment puts it in the past. Here we have another aorist indicative, but it's passive. Now in this case, phino, when it's in this this form, will lose the iota, so it just becomes ephane. All right, and now moving down here, we have Lego again. In this case, it's imperfect. So let me write that down. Imperfect is another form of past tense. And in English, we would usually use the word was saying, were saying with the ing using the present participle to indicate that this was an ongoing action. Or it could be something that was repeated in the past, like a habitual action. So imperfect is similar to we could say I used to say, or I was saying, and both of those have kind of that imperfect ongoing action in the past sense. So here we know now the Pharisees were saying, so you can see that it's something that they're doing ongoingly. It wasn't just they just said it once. And they said this statement here, by the prince of demons, he casts out demons. So our last verb here is ekbalo. We saw this earlier, to cast out or to throw out or to banish, and so forth. Ekbalo. In this case, we have a present indicative active, which is pretty easy. Remember that we just take our stem or the root, whatever you want to call it, and then you add your third person singular ending, which is the epsilon iota. All right, and then the last verses of our lesson are Matthew 9, verses 35 through 38. Kai peri egen ha Jesus tas pales pasas kai tas komas didaskon en tai synagogais auton kai keruson ta euangelion tes basileas kai therapion pasan nasan kai pasan malakian idon de tus aclus esplangnisthe periauton hati esan eskulmenoi kai erimenoi. Hose probata me ekanta poimena. Tate lege tois mathetais autou, hamen therismas palus. Hoide ergatai aligoi, de etheteun tu kuriou tu therismu, hapos ekbale, ergatas eis tan therisman autou. All right, so just to really quickly point out the types of verbs we have here, we have indicative in the indigo, and we have participles, and that's it. We have was going throughout, we're describing Jesus. We have was moved with compassion, which is a very strange verb. They were wearied, asan, which is the imperfect of ami. We'll talk about that next, but let me just write it here so you remember what I'm talking about. Ami means I am, so the imperfect tense. And then he says, another Lego, and beseech, which is ask or beg the Lord of the harvest to send out. Oh, whoops, we have one other down here. I forgot to note the sun glow is subjunctive. Sun glow. So subjunctive tense, in this case, we'll talk about this now, we might as well, that he might send out. Now see the difference here? This is actually asking the Lord to do something that we want him to do in the future, but it's not happened in reality yet. So that hapos, he might send out workmen into the harvest, into his harvest. So this is subjunctive. It's an indication that this is something that's wishful, that's hypothetical, and potentially may or may not happen. All right, and then we have a lot of examples of participles, as always. Present participle teaching, so describing what Jesus was doing in the synagogues, and proclaiming, keruson. And then we have another present participle, healing, therapion, and then having seen. In this case, it's going to be aorist because it's something that happened already. Idon, and notice here we have a similar ending, own. And this is also because of the second aorist changes. With the aorist, it takes the present endings. And then we have wearied, which eskulmenoi, and cast away. So the crowds were wearied and cast away. So this is using the verb to describe what the crowds were. And then having no shepherd, not having. Right, and notice we use may instead of oo before these non-indicative moods like the participles. Not having a shepherd. So I believe that we've covered all of these quickly. Let's go into more detail now. All right, so periagen comes from periago. Now remember, we saw ago before, leading. And this verb means to lead. So adding peri at the beginning means to lead around or to go about. So Jesus was going throughout the cities and the villages, teaching. So here, didasco, we just take our root, and then because it's nominative masculine singular, we just add own. Didascon, simple, present participle, nominative masculine singular. Should be very recognizable to you now. And again, we have the same thing, but instead we have this kerus root, which is at the beginning. That means to be a herald, to proclaim. So Jesus was teaching and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, the kingdom. And healing, again, therapuo, so we have this root, therapu, and you just add on, therapuon, healing every disease, pasan, nasan, and every sickness, pasan, malikian. All right, so idon. This is the aorist participle active of horao. Now this is one of those strange words that when you have an aorist form, it has a different beginning. And in this case, the root becomes id. And instead of having the aorist endings, we have the present participle endings with this weird second aorist. I'm just going to write second aorist every time we come across it, because one of these days I'll explain what that is to you, and then it'll all come together. All right, and then we have this really strange word. Now it comes from like the guts of someone, is this splag. Ugh, sounds kind of like guts. splag, nizomai. Now this here has the ending is like unk. I mean the sound is like unk, like an anchor. Splunk. So splunk nizomai. Splunk nizomai. Let's put SPL here to kind of forget. So splunk nizomai. Splunk nizomai. And in order to make this an aorist, notice we have this augment. Splank niste. All right, so in order to make this past tense, we add to the end of the root, which goes up to here. We have the augment, then we have the root. We have stay. So that's kind of their passive form. And notice it's not passive, it's actually an active sense. Like he was moved with compassion. He is emotional, basically. He was sensing this sadness for them. So that's an active meaning, but it's a middle-only verb. See with the omai here? So that's why it's a little bit strange to note that it's passive. It's more of an active verb in English. All right, and then here we have ason, which is our imperfect of ami. Ami, it means I am, I exist. So the imperfect is ason. So now we have a participle that has this R in front of it. We usually see the P for present and the A for aorist. But what is this R? Well, if you remember, it is perfect because P was already taken by present, so it had to go with R. So here we have a perfect participle that's middle or passive. All right, so this comes from skulo, to skin or to trouble someone. So if someone's being worried, they're troubled, they're being troubled. And then why do we want to use perfect? These people in the crowds were troubled, they were wary. So we're going to use a passive form here, right? Middle or passive form, because it shares the passive and middle. This menoi is the same for middle and passive verbs or usage. So we want to talk about them being worried. So in this case, perfect means that something had happened to them that brought them into a new state. So in this case, they had become or had been wearied or troubled. So it's a little bit strange, but this is what their current state is, wearied. Before they weren't, but now they are. So they had been wearied, had been troubled. So that's a reason why they're using perfect here. Something that happened to them and brought them into a new state. And again, cast away. They had been cast away. Having been cast away might have been a better translation. Now in English, we have a past participle, like having been or having gone. Those are past participles. Here it's almost like a past participle. They had become weary. So not just having been weary, they're having become weary. So that's why it's a perfect, something that they became. It's a new state. Having been cast away, same kind of idea. They had been cast away, not been having cast away, but having been cast away. They're now in this new cast away state. So the perfect is a little strange. I'm going to spend more time on the perfect in another lesson and you'll get it better. But right now it's just a kind of a superficial coverage of it. All right, now we have present active participle again, echanta, coming from echo, which is our verb for I have or I hold. So not having, me ekanta. And it's nominative neuter plural, which is why we have anta to cover these final verb forms. This one is pretty easy, present indicative active, lege. And notice it's the root is leg from Lego, here, our lexical form. And a, epsilon iota, is our third person singular ending. He says to his disciples, this is what's called a historical present because it happened in the past, but it's kind of like a story here. And we do this in English, when we tell stories. You could talk about something you did yesterday and say, so I go to the store and then I say to the guy. So that's kind of what we use in English too, when we use something that's present, but it's for the past. And then here we have ekbale. Now, in this form, we have two lambdas. This is a second aorist because it changes. The stem changes. Instead of ekbale in the aorist, we just change it to ekbal, and then we have the ending. And you'll notice from what we talked about before, we won't talk about more of the aorist. I don't want to confuse you too much. But this changes. It's not a huge change because it's just loses one lambda, but it does change a little bit for that aorist. And so we have aorist subjunctive, and we won't talk about subjunctive, but he might send out is a good translation, so that he would send out, so that we, it's kind of like a wishful thing. And then here, this is from the verb deomai. You can tell here, this is a middle only verb. Deethete, deethete. And it's an imperative, and it's aorist, passive. Beg, ask, request the Lord to send out more workmen into his harvest. Deethete. All right, so that brings us to the end of lesson 22. I want to thank you so much for joining us and for sticking it out. This was a tough lesson, but I really wanted to get into a lot of these verb forms and get you starting to look at them and recognizing them. Please join us next time for lesson 23. And please, if you haven't already, I'm sure you have, but please like videos that you find helpful. And of course, I'm sure you've subscribed by now if you've gotten to lesson 22. Thanks and have a great day. See you next time.